Ever since I first saw Cohagen capitulate, I've always wanted to build a Mars-themed board. I'm going to take some inspiration from what I consider to be Games Workshop's best worst product. And as always, if you've ever watched any of my videos before, I want to do it for as cheap as I possibly can. All of this yellow foam came straight out of a skip from a property development project just up the road from me. These 3 sheets of XPS foam are leftovers from last year's crafting budget. These artists' wooden panels were £15 each at the time of purchase, so combined with the leftover XPS from last year, so far I've spent 35 quid. And the first step is some drilling, some sawing, chiselling, and some thunder hammering. None of this is necessary, but I don't have room for a 6x4 foot board in my house. I've only got room for a combat patrol board. And I don't want a big chasm down the middle of my board because I'm trying to make it modular. Now, if you're using these artist wooden panels and you want a big boy board, I wouldn't be trying to attach them. I would be trying to make it modular just for ease of use and storage. And I use these panels simply because I don't have the room to keep the tools that are used to make these types of panels. They're readily available and really well built, so why wouldn't I use them? And speaking of board sizes, I'm constantly told that if it's not a 44 by 60 inch board and you're not playing 2000 points, you're not doing it correctly. What a load of bollocks that is, by the way. If you are thinking like that, you really need to take the stick out your eye. The recommended board sizes given to us by Games Workshop are exactly that. Recommended board sizes. But if you just do a little bit of mathematics, you'll find out that the recommended board sizes that Games Workshop recommends and the maximum army sizes that they recommend for those recommended board sizes comes to a ratio of 1.32 points per square inch. So it doesn't really matter what shape or what size your board is, as long as you know what the square inch, that doesn't sound right. So as long as you know what the square footage, so as long as you're aware of how big the footprint of your board is, you can work out the maximum point size for each army quite easily. So whatever size board that you want to build, especially if you're limited by space, you build that size of board. I added these 4 battens for rigidity and then screwed everything together. These actually came from the same skip as the yellow foam. And on the other side, I've glued down the XPS sheets, and I've done that with Gorilla Grab adhesive. But I do need to find a way to protect the XPS from getting bashed. So I ripped apart a cot that my neighbour had sitting in their front garden. And don't worry, the kid doesn't need the cot anymore, and I had permission. But these obviously weren't the right size, so I had to figure out where the best place to position them was, because I was going to screw in through the top of them directly into the wooden panels underneath, and that will sandwich the foam and hopefully protect it in case any of the corners get bashed. This part of the build took me the most amount of time for the board because everything had to be lined up perfectly to make the next steps of the build process as easy as possible. And it didn't always go to plan. Fortunately, I didn't spill a drop, but I did learn my lesson. I finished this little section off here and then took the board to the floor to finish off the rest of the framework. More often than not, when you're using free or recycled materials, you tend to have to do a little bit of extra work. So I now need to fill all these little holes. And I'm actually going to do that with my hot glue gun, but I'm still going to leave a little bit of room at the top of each hole because this will all get covered in filler and sanded back before any primer touches it. As I said earlier, Games Workshop's best worst product. These are great for your first game, but if you enjoy that game, you're going to want to upgrade it pretty quickly. I raided my bits box for all these little pieces, some 3D printed bits, some terrain that I never used, there's parts from old kids' toys. But you'll notice it's all a lot smaller than the stuff that's on the paper mat. 2 reasons. First of all, I'm going to be making some large rock formations later in this video, and I think half a building appearing from the bottom of a huge cliff face is going to look a bit ridiculous. But I think the main reason is I don't want to spend 3 days 3D printing stuff that I probably won't use anyway. Once I figured out where I wanted each of the individual pieces to go, which took me a little while because what I wanted to do was make it appear that whatever had happened here had happened years ago, and sediment had been blown back over it all, so you could only see little peaks and troughs of bits and bobs to try and give the appearance that history was repeating itself. I marked everything out so I knew where it was all going, and then using I think you call them a box cutter in America, don't you? I don't know, it's a blade of some variety, very fancy. And an old lino cutter, which I actually ended up breaking. I dug into the foam because I want the peak of each one of these pieces to be level with the top surface of the foam. Which means when I put any type of terrain down on the board, none of these pieces get in the way at all. And I can actually cover them up if I wanted to. Once all the holes had been cut, each piece was glued into place with a hot glue gun. This gives an instant bond, but make sure your hot glue gun isn't set too hot, otherwise it will melt the foam. The only bit I didn't glue was this little grate. I did dig out all of the foam from this little section because I've got a special plan for this little bit. Next on the to-do list is filling and sanding. I hate sanding, but it needs doing. But so far, so good. I have spared you the indignity of having to watch a fat, tick-tocking woodworker jiggle for a sandwich. And to be quite fair, TikTok can tock off. And so can airbrushes. They're great, but they're an absolute pain in the ass to clean. And any opportunity that presents itself, I will take a rattle can over an airbrush. So before I actually prime this board, I need to see all the foam, because unfortunately, some of the propellant in the rattle cans can melt the foam. All I'm really doing is mixing water and Mod Podge. I did add a little bit of paint, but the paint is only there so I can see where I've actually been painting. I don't use specific ratios. I start off roughly 50-50 water Mod Podge, and then if I feel like I need more Mod Podge added, then I add some more. I do tend to verge on the side of leaving it a little bit more runny, and the reason for that is because foam has a texture to it, and you really need to make sure that all of the foam is covered. And the easiest way to do that at this stage is a runnier mixture and multiple layers. It does take a little while to do because you have to take into account drying times, But this process is actually repeated through. I have spared you the indignity of having to watch a fat. After everything had been primed, I laid down some flat colours on what's let's call the salvage. And it's time to finally glue this piece in place. I've never used a mobile phone for filming before. And the main reason for that is because I don't own one, but I was donated an old phone by a friend, and I still don't have a SIM card, but I think I might have found a use for it. It certainly should be more productive than smashing this phone to pieces to rip it apart for parts for kit bashing, but that is still very much on the cards. If you remember from earlier, there was a piece that I cut where I removed all of the foam. Well, it was for this bit, and what I've done is I've filled it full of Citadel skulls. The idea is to give the board just a little bit of depth so it's not an entirely flat surface. With this little grate on top, it gives the impression of some sort of dungeon, I suppose? I think now I just need a dragon, don't I? This is horticultural sand. Now I haven't bought this specifically for crafting, so it's more free material. I use this in my garden. Ah, the joys of filming when you have a little mate. Its primary use is actually drainage. I add it to potting soil and compost to add to beds for growing food and flowers, because of course the wife loves a flower, as they usually do. But for that purpose I only really need the coarser grains that are in this bag of horticultural sand, the small sort of little stone type pieces. And once I have aggressively agitated the aggregate, that was a mouthful, I'm left with this, which is perfect for, well, you'll see in a second. The darker parts you can see on the board is actually where I laid filler previously, just to help bury all these salvage parts and of course make the transition between one piece of XPS and the other as smooth as possible. And I'm trying to follow up that same mentality with the PVA glue by carefully pushing it up as close to and actually on top of some of these salvage parts, because I want to continue that buried aesthetic. You don't need to be 100% accurate, but being as accurate as you can will help. And once you've done the edges of the salvage parts, you need to thin down the PVA glue as much as you possibly can, because you don't want big clumps of glue as it dries. And the reason why I'm using a pretty cheap bog standard PVA glue is because, well, I'm going to use a lot of it, so I don't really want to waste Mod Podge or Gorilla Wood glue on this part. Then out come the rescued finer sand particles and we cover the glue. I did all of this in sections. I started with all the salvaged areas or parts, let that dry, and then went back and filled in all the gaps so I had a final base layer to continue working from. That base layer turned out exactly as expected. A little bit patchy, and you can see there's a few channels that need to be filled up. So the first things first is mask off all the black border. Then just using a piece of foam from my little pile from earlier on, I'm just going to make sure that the board is as level as I possibly can, because in a bit we're also going to be using a lot of liquids. Another layer of sand was added, but this time to make sure that everything was fairly level. I've got an old piece of cardboard just to protect everything that's around me, because this time I'm going to use IPA and homemade sealant to make sure that all of the sand that I've just laid down sticks firmly. I'll leave some information to the sealant recipe that I use down in the description because it's never failed me yet. But make sure when you're using your sealant, you clean the spray part out before you put it away and leave it until you need it next time, because yeah, I'd left glue in the spray section and it had all glued up, not going to work, so I had to go away and change it. Just rinse it out with some hot water before you put it away. Honestly, it makes life so much easier. Plus it means you don't waste a bunch of IPA as it all starts to evaporate while you're busy looking for another scoosh. But we got there in the end, and I just systematically worked through the board, laying down some IPA, laying some sealant over the top of that, and let the whole thing go absolutely bone dry. There will still be a few pieces of loose sand, that is inevitable, and to solve that you just repeat the process again. But don't worry, I'm not going to make the same editing joke I made when I said repeat earlier. We have seen many different versions of Mars over the years, but we'll never know what it really looks like until someone steps foot on the planet. But for what I want for this build, the word that's in the back of my head is cadmium. So I've got a cadmium light tone, cadmium yellow, and a cadmium dark tone to start painting with. Oh, please excuse that weird little black and white bit, but for some reason the over-the-shoulder camera set itself to night mode, even though it doesn't have a night mode. But I have since managed to fix it.
Many. So me say many. How many mics do we rip on the deli? Many money. So me say many.
Using those three colours that I mentioned, my intention is to paint this with varying dilutions and colours of different washes. This will mean it'll take several layers to get right, but it's worth taking the time, I think. And as a starting base tone, this looks pretty good to me. I'm decanting this wash into a smaller little tub to make it a little bit easier to, well, move around, but also because I don't want any of the actual acrylic pigment on the board. I just want the wash.
Max, do we rip on the deli? Many money. We say many.
When I started applying the wash, I was just using the paintbrush like a paintbrush, but this didn't particularly work out very well. The wash didn't sit nicely on the texture, and I could see that it was going to be very difficult to get sort of nice effective transitions and blends between different washes. So I had to try and figure out another way to make this work. What I ended up doing was not so much stippling, but using a stabbing technique. And what it allowed me to do was leave little pools of wash on the board, which has helped create colour variations actually within each individual wash. And as is very much the theme of this video, this process was repeated 5-6 times with different colour washes. I wanted to bring a bit more red in than the Games Workshop orange colour, well, because of Total Recall. That classic 1980s weird blood red Mars was what I wanted to build. And if I can get this angle right, you can see just how much texture is on this completely flat board. The weird little dungeon bit is absolutely my favourite detail on the whole thing. And if we just take a look at the rest of the board, you can see how nice the colour transitions are from more of the oranges to more of the deeper reds, and with the natural colour of the sand. And no dry brushing. This was the easiest way I think I've ever